I want to talk a little bit today about argument. Now, if you're studying the humanities at a university level, argument is absolutely crucial. In fact, what we want in university level study differs from what goes on in, say, schools, probably most conspicuously by the demand to have an argument, to have independent critical thought, to have an analysis. It's also fairly central to the way that grades are determined. If you look at the marking descriptions, the difference between a 2-2 and a 2-1, or indeed a 2-1 and a first, often that comes down to the quality of the argument, or in fact, and this is particularly relevant to the 2-1-2-2 boundary, whether there is any argument there at all. A 2-2 essay may have a lot of good knowledge, it may refer to appropriate parts of the text, but if it doesn't have an argument, then that's probably why it's a 2-2 and not a 2-1. So if you are a student at university studying in the humanities, then mastering argument and knowing what a good argument is, knowing what an argument is full stop, is going to be very, very imperative. So what is an argument? I think that's quite a hard thing to teach. And I was thinking about this question, and it struck me that there's actually quite a limited palette of gestures that is used in academic writing. And so I thought it might be helpful to class what are, I think, the 5 most common arguments which would be used by literary scholars. And if we look at the secondary criticism that we direct you to read, things like monographs, articles, then most of the arguments you will find there will probably fall into one of these 5 categories. And certainly looking back at my own published work, I would also say most of the arguments I have made probably fall into one of these 5 categories. So I'm going to try and explain these 5 arguments today so you can use them, and I'm also going to give examples from where they've cropped up in the lectures I've given this term on EN256, that is the Victorian to Modern course at NUI Maynooth. So without further ado, what are these 5 arguments? 1. Apply a theory to a text. Now, I'm going to get this out of the way first because I think it's probably the least suitable for undergraduate use, even though it's very useful at further study. If you're doing an undergraduate dissertation, this might be one of the argumentative gestures that you want to use. Basically, you take a theory and you apply it to a text. It could be something like Habermas's theory of the public sphere, or it could be a feminist theory of gender construction. In certain courses, you will be asked to do this kind of argument, particularly in literary theory courses. In general, it's rather tricky because it demands not only knowledge of the text, but a good solid knowledge of the theory. A slight twist on this is not necessarily a literary theory, but say an argument that's been made by an academic about a different text, where you apply that argument, that set of conclusions to the text that you're looking at. So, for example, you might be studying a 19th century women poet, and then you come and look at a different book, say Isabel Armstrong's book. You can say Armstrong has made an argument about Rossetti, and then you apply that argument to a different 19th century poet, female poet like Elizabeth Barrett Browning. That's the same kind of argumentative gesture. It's about taking something here and then applying it to your text. Now, I did this a few times in the lectures. For example, I used structuralism and I applied it to the Sherlock Holmes stories, if you remember. Similarly, when I was discussing George Eliot, I made quite a few references to George Lukács, the Hungarian Marxist theorist, and his model of how the realist novel depicted the world and why realism was a good thing because it captures the interconnectedness of the socio-economic factors in the world. And I said, well, this is one way of looking at and illuminating George Eliot's own handling of interconnectedness. So that's the first argument, apply a theory to a text. Number 2, revision or subversion of form. Now, all texts have a genre or a form. We might look at a text and say this is a sonnet, or this is pastoral, or this is a modernist text, or this is a romantic text, whatever it may be. And those kind of frames, forms, genres, they help us understand what a text is trying to do. But crucially, very few text, arguably no text at all, is absolutely characteristic or stereotypical. And if it was, it would probably be quite boring to read. No text is absolutely a pastoral. No text is absolutely a modernist text. There is always a kind of difference or gap. And we can exploit that gap, explain that gap, to illuminate what's going on in the text. So, for example, in my Middlemarch lectures, yes, Middlemarch is a realist novel. It draws from the template, the genre of realism. But one of the running questions I asked was, in what ways does Middlemarch subvert or go beyond that realist paradigm? And when it does so, what is it doing and why might that be interesting? Similarly, in my Gissing lecture, I talked about Lou and Liz in terms of the fallen woman narrative, which is a kind of form or genre which was very common in the Victorian period. And I showed that Gissing was deliberately trying to subvert that template, that form. And again, there were interesting consequences to that. So whenever you're looking at the text, yes, any text, you want to identify what genre or form it might fall under, but you also want to think about in what ways it departs from or differs from that form or genre and why that difference might be going on. And that's a very common argumentative technique. Contestation, revision, subversion of form, be that genre or a specific form like a sonnet. Argument number 3, articulate a context. Now, here it is where you spot a feature or a series of features in a literary text, and you go on to explain why they might be there by referring to a historical context. And you can structure this 2 ways round. You can begin with a historical context and then go to the text, or you can start with the text and go to the context. It doesn't really matter, but the important thing is you're identifying some features and then giving depth by explaining a context which explains those features. So for example, in the Middlemarch lectures, I talked about Eliot's narrative technique, and I used the context of 19th century Victorian science, positivism, scientific observation, those kind of things, to explain that narrative position and that narrative ambition in Eliot's fiction. And I showed that Eliot was deliberately modelling what she was doing in Middlemarch after science. And I suggested on more than one occasion that in this sense she was a kind of experimental novelist. Similarly, in the Sherlock Holmes lectures, I went to Walter Pater's theory of relative truth as a way of describing what was going on in 19th century epistemology, that is, 19th century's attitude to knowledge and the gaining of knowledge. And I used Pater's theory of relative truth as a way of illuminating what the character of Sherlock Holmes is as a function of knowledge, as an observer, and someone who comes through and follows this 3-stage model: theorise, observe, prove. Argument number 4: is your text conservative or radical in relation to its age? Now, particularly with the rise of identity politics in literary studies, things like feminist analyses, post-colonial analyses, this question has become more and more commonly asked. And it's a question of simply saying, is your text conservative or radical, and proving it one way or the other. So, for example, you might say, yes, this text is conservative. Or you might say, yes, this text is radical. And indeed, you can begin to twist this or make it more complex. You can say, in large part, this text is conservative, but it has a subversive edge. Or yes, in large part, this text is conservative, but in making its conservative gestures, it sort of exposes some of the problems with that conservatism. Or you can say, yes, this text is in large part radical, but at a certain point it becomes conservative. It has a conservative limit. And this kind of argument about conservatism versus radicalism was very important to a lot of the things I was doing in my Middlemarch lectures. So, for example, the lectures on Dorothea, I was suggesting that Dorothea is a figure constituted by restless desire, by her dislocation from the community and the norms of the community. And in that sense, she's a very radical figure. But I also said that what Eliot does can be read conservatively, in that particularly the ending brings Dorothea back within the template of marriage, and she steps back into the private sphere, she steps back into the sphere of feeling and sympathy. And that's a classic, yes, this text is radical, but it has a conservative limit argument, and that was the argument I was making there. We can also see the same kind of argument in what I was saying about Eliot and labour, or Eliot and work and capitalism. Yes, she has a quite radical or subversive attitude to Victorian modernity, Victorian labour, but the way she does that is through, say, the Guards and a quite retrogressive or perhaps reactionary flight into a kind of pastoral world of work, which is represented by the Garths. So again, when you're looking at a text, think about, is it conservative? Is it radical? Is it radical with a conservative edge or limit? Is it conservative with some kind of radical edge? It's never a simple question, but it is a question always worth asking. And number 5, the final one, refine the viewpoint, add an extra angle. And I can explain this most simply by saying what you're saying here is, yes, X, but also Y, or yes, A, but however, B. What you're doing is you're bringing in one set of arguments and then you're adding an extra angle, refining the viewpoint. In academic work, you'll often see this argument in the form of where the scholar comes forward and says, existing criticism on this work has made these valuable arguments A, B, C, but what they've missed out, what they've admitted is D, and my argument is all about D. So it has this structure, yes, X, but also Y. And I use this argumentative structure, again, quite a few times in my lectures. So for example, I said Middlemarch is a novel all about youth and about vocation and about idealism, but it also has very strong strands of cynicism. So for example, when I looked in the 5th lecture, I think it was, at the Bulstrode plot, I'm saying, isn't it interesting that all the older characters have a kind of jaded cynicism, and we can play this off against the ambition and idealism of the younger characters, and we can bring that whole viewpoint in to look at the ending. So yes, Middlemarch is a novel about youthful vocation, but it also has strong strands of cynicism. Similarly, in my lecture on Gissing, I talked all about the way that he was quite radical in bringing working class lives to representation. I described this as a kind of nether realism. So yes, Gissing is a nether realism. Yes, he represents working class lives, but, and here's that twist again, but there are questions about whether he strikes the balance of representation correctly. So for example, is he too sentimental in depicting the working class, or is he too pessimistic in depicting the working class? Does he offer them any avenues of escape? And it's those kind of questions that allow us to refine our view of Gissing's realism. And again, it's got exactly that same structure. Yes, X, Gissing does represent working class lives, but there are questions of whether he balances that representation correctly. And of course, you can put these argumentative gestures together. So for example, we could create a long argument, probably too long for an exam essay, but perhaps for a longer piece of work, an argument like this about Middlemarch. Yes, Middlemarch subverts the realist form, which is radical in way X. But if we look at something else, Y, then we can see a conservative limit to her fiction. And there we've dragged together 2 or 3 of those gestures and put them together into an argument. And you can do that yourself. So there are at least 5 types of argument, and I think these are the 5 most common types of argument, forms of argument, that you'll find in scholarly writing. 1, apply a theory to a text, bring something else in, put it in there. Number 2, think about form. No text is absolutely identical to its form. All texts will play with, mediate, manipulate, contest, subvert their form or genre. Identify where that's happening and explain why it might be interesting. 3, articulate context. Look at features in a novel or a play or a poem and then bring in historical contexts to explain why those features are there and what's going on. Number 4, think about whether your text is inside or outside of the cultural and sociological and ideological norms of its era. Is it conservative? Is it radical? Is that a cut and dried question insofar that conservative texts will often show up certain radical elements and radical texts will often have certain conservative limits? And finally, 5, refine viewpoints, bring in extra angles. Bring an argument that has this X-Y structure. Yes, X, but also Y. Always refine the viewpoint, bring in that extra angle. And remember, of course, you can put multiple arguments together. So those are 5 of the most common intellectual arguments you'll find in literary criticism, in literary studies. You might be feeling still a bit confused. How do I know if I've got an argument? So I'll finish off with 2 perhaps simpler tips. 1, try and have a thesis statement. So, for example, a thesis statement would be something like Middlemarch is a novel of youthful vocation, but it has strong strands of cynicism. That was when I was using argument number 5, the yes X, but also Y form. But Middlemarch is a novel of vocation, but with strong strands of cynicism. That's a kind of thesis statement. And the interesting thing is that a thesis statement that is a genuine argument will have a more complex grammar about it. It will have words like because, therefore, nevertheless, however, but, and those show that there are interesting relationships going on. There's depth and sophistication and complexity to your thesis, to your argument. If your thesis statement is something like yes and something and something and, that and grammar shows that you don't really have an argument. The second crucial thing is don't take terms as read. If you're asked a question about gender, the chances are the lecturer thinks that gender is not a simple cut and dried thing, because otherwise why ask the question? What you should be doing is thinking about the complexities and the internal tensions that relate to the term that you're discussing. Most of the arguments, the argument types I've just described, those 5, what they could be reduced to is, and defined as, is exposing tensions. We see that, for example, in the is it conservative or is it radical or is it both? When texts have a form and yet they subvert it. When we have this argument yes X but also Y. All those 3 arguments rely on exposing tensions and contradictions and problems. And that's what we want to see in an academic essay is you going in and showing that terms, be it gender, be it landscape, be it genre, be it whatever, they're not simple, they're not cut and dried. What they conceal is tensions and complexities, and in your argument, in your essay, you should be going in and picking apart those terms, breaking those terms apart, and showing where those tensions and contradictions are and how the literary texts respond to them. So, when you come into your exam, when you write an essay, please, please, please try to have an argument. And remember, it's not as hard as it looks, because academics probably only use 5 arguments. Maybe that's a bit reductive. I'm sure there's a few others. But if you can think about those 5, then you're off to a good start.